None of her children attended her birthday. Months later, when they read the will, everyone screamed after hearing something they never expected. The evening shadows lengthened over Mrs. Victoria's grand mansion, casting a melancholic silence over every corner. Once filled with the joyful laughter and lively games of her children, the mansion now resembled more of a mausoleum of memories than a home. The walls were adorned with family portraits, snapshots of lost smiles, and moments that seemed to belong to a different lifetime. The rooms, once bustling with life, were now shrouded in a layer of dust, and the echo of Mrs. Victoria's solitary footsteps resonated with an almost tangible sadness. In the dining room, a long, gleaming table was meticulously set. A large white tablecloth covered its surface, and on top lay 3 sets of dishes, silver cutlery, and crystal glasses that shimmered under the dim candlelight. Each place at the table was arranged with loving care, napkin rings adorned with embroidered initials and the names of her children, Carlos, Esteban, and Martha, written by hand on small cards that Mrs. Victoria had crafted with the delicate calligraphy she used for her letters. Everything, from the scent of lavender candles filling the room to the painstakingly prepared dishes, spoke of her desire to bring her children together for one special evening. As she waited in the parlor, Mrs. Victoria glanced at the grandfather clock, its pendulum marking the hours with a solemnity that felt almost cruel. She had spent the entire week preparing this dinner, with the naive hope that, just this once, her children would put aside their busy lives and come to celebrate her 75th birthday. For Carlos, the eldest son and a successful businessman, she had prepared his favorite lamb stew, slow-cooked with spices just as she used to make it when he was a child. For Esteban, the middle child, always so sensitive and with peculiar tastes, she had made his favorite vegetarian lasagna with goat cheese, remembering how he would request it every time he returned home from college. And for Martha, the youngest, her signature chocolate cake filled with strawberries, a dessert that always lit up her face with joy. But the house remained silent, and the clock continued its indifferent march forward. "Perhaps they're running a little late," she murmured to herself, glancing at the entrance with a fragile hope. "I'm sure they're on their way." Mrs. Victoria rose from the table and made her way to the living room. She settled into her favorite armchair, an old green velvet seat that she had shared with her husband during happier times. Her gaze wandered to the collection of photographs on the wall. There were her 3 children, captured forever in their childhood. Carlos with his natural leadership air, Esteban with his shy, dreamy smile, and Martha, the little one, always coquettish and eager to please. The memory of how they would sit on their father's lap, laughing and playing under the shade of the great oak tree in the garden, was so vivid that she could almost hear their voices. But now, those moments seemed to belong to another era, to another family. The sound of the phone startled her, echoing through the stillness of the room. She stood up quickly, her heart pounding with hope that perhaps one of her children was calling to say they were on their way. She picked up the receiver with trembling hands and listened. "Mom!" Carlos's voice, dry and distant, echoed through the line. There was no warmth, no emotion in his words. "I have an important meeting that I can't postpone. Happy birthday. I hope you understand." Before Mrs. Victoria could respond, the line went dead. The pain struck her like a knife, but she forced herself to smile, as if trying to convince herself it was just a misunderstanding. Carlos had always been ambitious, always striving for greater heights. One day he'll realize what truly matters, she thought, trying to cling to a comfort that felt increasingly hollow. She returned to the dining room and sat down again. The clock's hands continued their cruel, indifferent march. 6 o'clock, 7, 8. The next message came on her cell phone, a text from Esteban, the son who had lost his way years ago. "I'm busy, Mom. I can't come. I'm trying to focus on my recovery. We'll talk later." The screen of her phone blinked and then went dark, leaving Mrs. Victoria with a lump in her throat. Recovery. From what? She knew perfectly well that Esteban still hadn't overcome his addictions, that he was still fighting his demons. And yet, her heart broke seeing how he continued to use it as an excuse, a shield to justify his absence. But she said nothing. She closed her eyes and prayed silently, wishing that, wherever he was, Esteban would find the peace he so desperately needed. And Martha, her little Martha, didn't even bother to send a message. Hours later, as Mrs. Victoria lit the last candle and sat down at the table with her hopes shattered, she saw the notification on her phone. Martha was live streaming from a luxurious party, surrounded by friends and laughter, wearing a tight red dress and a radiant smile that seemed to outshine the room's lights. The image was like a dagger to Mrs. Victoria's heart. She hadn't even remembered today was her birthday. "Happy birthday, Mum," she whispered in a barely audible voice, staring at the empty screen before her. The clock struck 9. The food had grown cold, and the candles were slowly burning out, casting long shadows on the empty walls. Mrs. Victoria served herself a small slice of her chocolate cake, the same one she had prepared especially for Martha, and cut a piece with trembling hands. She lifted the spoon to her lips, but the taste wasn't sweet. It was bitter, like the void she felt in her chest. Finally, she stood up, blew out the candles, and cleared the table with slow, almost ceremonial movements. The plates, the glasses, and the cards with her children's names were put away with utmost care. With each item she put back in its place, she felt as if she was burying another piece of hope, another part of herself. But when she finished, a spark of determination ignited in her eyes. She would not allow this to be the end. If her children couldn't see what they were truly losing, she would make sure they understood, even if she had to break every bond and rebuild them from scratch. That very night, sitting at her desk, she began to write a letter. It wasn't a farewell letter, but a plan. A plan to save her children from themselves, a plan that would change their lives forever. Mrs. Victoria awoke the next day with a renewed strength. She picked up the phone and dialed Ricardo's number, her old friend and trusted lawyer. Her words were firm and clear. "Ricardo, I want you to help me fake my own death." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, but she remained undeterred. She knew what she wanted. She knew what she had to do. "Please, Ricardo," she added, her voice soft but resolute. "If you've ever truly wanted to help me, now is the time. I want my children to understand what they've lost, and the only way to do that is by losing me for real." Ricardo sighed deeply, and then finally agreed. The transformation had begun. The news of Mrs. Victoria's death spread quickly, like a cold wind that swept through the family's world without warning. The three siblings received the call with different reactions, but deep in their hearts, they all shared the same thought: the end of an era and the beginning of an inevitable conflict over the inheritance. The official report stated that their mother had died unexpectedly of a heart attack. Carlos, the eldest, was the first to find out. When the phone rang in his office, he was in the middle of an important business meeting. His face, usually impassive, hardened as Ricardo, the family's lawyer, informed him of his mother's death. He didn't shed a tear, nor did he show any emotion. His mind, trained to respond to any crisis, immediately began calculating. "The will?" he asked coldly, interrupting Ricardo's calm voice. "Yes, it will be read tomorrow at the mansion," replied the lawyer somberly. Carlos hung up and remained silent for a few seconds. Around him, the executives continued discussing the company's projections, but he no longer heard a word they were saying. His mother had been the central figure of the family, the administrator of the family's wealth, and now that fortune would pass into his hands. He felt a mix of relief and triumph, hidden behind his mask of impassiveness. "Finally, I'll be able to run things my way," he thought. But at the back of his mind, there was a tiny sting of doubt. Why hadn't Ricardo mentioned anything specific about the will? Esteban, on the other hand, was in a completely different place when he received the news. The smoky, dim-lit dive bar where he spent most of his days was filled with the murmur of broken souls nursing their misery. He was surrounded by men with hollow eyes, each lost in their own sorrow. When his phone vibrated, Esteban blinked, dazed from the alcohol. Ricardo's voice seemed distant, like a distorted echo seeping through his fogged-up mind. "Your mother has passed away, Esteban," Ricardo said with his usual calm tone. The glass of whiskey almost slipped from his hand. "What?" he mumbled, then a bitter smile crept onto his face. A part of him had been waiting for that moment for years. But instead of feeling sadness or even relief, the only thing he felt was a deeper emptiness. His mother had been his last link to decency, and now he was utterly alone in his spiral of decay. His first reaction wasn't to call his siblings or head to the mansion. No. The first person he called was his drug dealer. He knew that the reading of the will would bring a unique opportunity to get the money he so desperately needed to pay off his debts and finally free himself from the chains he had tied around his own wrists. Or so he kept telling himself. Martha, the youngest daughter, didn't even answer Ricardo's call. She was busy at a photo shoot for her latest social media project. Dressed in haute couture and surrounded by assistants adjusting the lights and the angles, she noticed the missed call notification with a flicker of irritation. What could her mother possibly want now? It wasn't until the shoot was over that she checked her messages and read the words, "Your mother has passed away." For a moment she froze, but the feeling didn't last long. Instead of sadness, she felt a sudden urgency. The inheritance. How much would she get? What specific properties had been left to her? Could she perhaps turn the mansion into her own private event venue? She quickly stood up and began scrolling through her schedule. There was something more important to plan than a funeral. Her future. The three siblings arrived at the family mansion the next day, each carrying their own hidden agenda and emotions, buried under layers of cynicism and greed. The great house, now dim and cold, seemed to greet them with a chilling indifference. The only person waiting for them was Ricardo, the lawyer and Mrs. Victoria's trusted friend, standing firm at the entrance with an expression so stoic that none of them could read anything in his eyes. He led them to the grand hall of the mansion, a place that once radiated warmth and love, but now harbored only ghostly memories and shadowed corners. The atmosphere was tense. None of the siblings exchanged more than fleeting glances. Carlos sat with his back straight and lips pressed tight, his gaze fixed on Ricardo as if trying to decipher what he was thinking. Esteban, with dark circles under his eyes and a nearly imperceptible tremor in his hands, slumped in the farthest armchair, his indifferent expression failing to fully conceal his anxiety. Martha, on the other hand, kept her phone in her hand, idly scrolling through it, though her eyes occasionally flickered toward her mother's desk with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Thank you for coming," Ricardo began, breaking the silence with a grave tone. "Before we proceed with the reading of the will, I must show you something Mrs. Victoria left specifically for this moment." With a deliberate motion, Ricardo turned on a large screen that had been set up on the wall of the hall. The siblings exchanged confused looks as the image of their mother appeared on the screen. Mrs. Victoria, seated in her favorite armchair, looked directly at the camera. She appeared calm, but there was something in her eyes that conveyed an intensity they had never seen before. "My dear children," she began, and her voice echoed through the room with a resonance that seemed to transcend time and space. "If you're watching this, it means I'm no longer here with you. But before you think about the inheritance, I want to tell you a few truths you've been avoiding for years." Carlos shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Esteban leaned forward, startled by his mother's firm tone. And Martha, for the first time in a long while, set her phone aside, her gaze fixed on the screen as if she couldn't look away. "I've watched as you drifted away from me and from the values your father and I tried to instill in you. Each of you has allowed your own ambitions, insecurities, and vanities to consume you. And throughout all this time, I've tried to help, tried to show you what really matters. But I have failed. The silence in the room was overwhelming. Mrs. Victoria's voice grew softer, but also sharper. That's why I've made a decision. None of you will receive the inheritance unless you can prove that you have truly changed. I have left each of you a specific challenge designed to make you face your greatest flaws. Only when you complete these tasks will the will be activated. But if you decide not to accept them, or if you fail any of them, everything will be donated to charity. The expressions on the faces of the three children shifted from disbelief to fury. "This is ridiculous," Carlos exclaimed, standing up abruptly. "What kind of game is this?" Esteban growled, his voice trembling with anger. Martha just stared at the screen, mouth agape, unable to process what she was hearing. "This is my final will," continued Mrs. Victoria in the video. "It's not a game, Carlos. It's not a test, Esteban. It's not a lesson, Martha. It's my way of giving you one last chance to become the people I know you can be. If you truly want the inheritance, you'll have to earn it. But more important than the money, I hope you understand that what I'm really trying to give you is the chance to rediscover yourselves as a family." The video stopped. Silence filled the room again, heavy and oppressive. "So, what do you decide?" Ricardo asked calmly. The three siblings looked at each other with eyes full of rage and wounded pride. But in the end, one by one, they nodded reluctantly. "We'll do it," Carlos said, his voice clipped. "I won't let my mother control my life, even after she's dead," Esteban spat, but accepted grudgingly. "If that's what it takes," murmured Martha, her lips trembling slightly. "I'll do it." Ricardo nodded, and without saying another word, handed each of them an envelope. Inside, each envelope contained a letter with the detailed instructions of their tasks. "Good luck," he said simply. The three siblings stood up and left the mansion with dark expressions and hearts full of resentment. But Ricardo knew something they had yet to grasp. These tasks were not just about earning the inheritance. They were Mrs. Victoria's final attempt to save her family before it was too late. And so, the real battle began. Carlos stared disdainfully at the facade of the community kitchen where he would be spending the next 3 months of his life. The place was small, with faded walls and a half-fallen sign that read, "Hope's Kitchen." It was an ordinary building, tucked away in a rundown part of town. The alleyways around it were filled with desperate people and hollow faces. Nothing he saw seemed remotely valuable. In fact, in his mind, it was nothing but a waste of time, an absurd test designed by his mother to make him suffer. Carlos hadn't been there even a day and was already planning his escape. 3 months in this dingy place? It was unacceptable. As the owner of one of the most successful companies in the country, he was accustomed to expensive suits, high-level meetings, and the unwavering devotion of his subordinates. He had nothing in common with the people who came to this kitchen to beg for a plate of food. But still, his mother's words echoed in his mind. "Carlos, you have the opportunity to rediscover yourself. Without the money, without the power, you have 3 months to learn what truly matters." He knew he could ignore the instructions and leave, but losing the inheritance was not an option. That fortune, the grand mansion, the family lands and properties, not only represented power, but also symbolized everything he had worked for in his life. So, with a look of disgust and resignation, he pushed open the door to the kitchen. The inside was even more depressing than the exterior. There were long rows of worn-out tables and chairs, many of them wobbly, with tablecloths that, although clean, showed the stains of years of use. The few volunteers present eyed him with curiosity and a hint of suspicion. It was obvious that Carlos, with his stiff posture and impeccably pressed clothing, didn't belong there. An older man, with a graying beard and a stained t-shirt, approached him. "New here?" the man asked gruffly, looking him up and down with eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his appearance. "Yes," Carlos responded curtly. "My name is Carlos Diaz. I'm here." He cleared his throat, as if saying the next words caused him physical discomfort. "I'm here to volunteer." The man let out a brief, rough laugh. "Volunteer, huh? Well, welcome, Carlos. We don't make distinctions between new or old, rich or poor here. Everyone puts their hands to work." He slapped Carlos on the back in a way that felt unnecessarily familiar to him. "I'm George, the manager. Follow me and I'll show you what to do." George led him to the back of the kitchen where the cooking area was. The air smelled of stew and freshly baked bread, but there was also a sharper scent of disinfectant and cleaning products. George pointed to a massive pile of unpeeled carrots and potatoes. "Your first task is simple. Peel them and cut them for today's lunch. Think you can handle that?" Carlos looked at him in disbelief. Him, a businessman used to closing multi-million-dollar deals, peeling carrots? But he swallowed his indignation and nodded. With clumsy hands, he began to work. Each movement was slow and awkward for someone like him, who had never done anything so menial in his life. The first days passed with Carlos doing similar tasks, chopping vegetables, washing dishes, cleaning tables. But he did so with the bare minimum of effort, feeling like every hour spent there was an insult to his status and position. However, the other volunteers and the people coming to the kitchen largely ignored him, as if he were invisible. Only George, with his unyielding patience, took the time to teach him, correcting him whenever something went wrong. Each afternoon, when the kitchen doors opened, Carlos watched the multitude of faces that crowded in for a simple hot meal. Elderly people, single mothers with small children, men with dirt-streaked hands and disheveled hair. At first, Carlos avoided looking at them directly. He felt their gazes were judgmental, as if they could see through his facade. But over time, he began to notice something else in their expressions: resignation, but also gratitude. There was a young mother who always came in holding two small children by the hand. The little ones, wearing oversized clothes and worn-out shoes, always looked up at him with wide, shining eyes when he served them. At first, Carlos didn't think much of them, but each time he saw them, he felt a small tug inside, something he hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, as he served them, he overheard the older child, no more than 6 years old, whispering to his mother, "Can we come back tomorrow, Mommy? I like it when the man with the clean shirt serves us." The mother, visibly uncomfortable, gave him a shy smile. "Of course, darling." Carlos felt an unexpected pang in his chest. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the boy and the mother who sacrificed every bite so that her children could eat. Something inside him began to change, very slowly. He remembered when he was a child, and his mother, Mrs. Victoria, would cook simple stews with the little they had before the family fortune grew. He remembered how she would always serve him the largest portion, saying that he needed it more because he had big dreams to fulfill one day. He had forgotten those small sacrifices, those gestures only a mother would make. The days turned into weeks, and the barrier between Carlos and the people he served began to crumble. One day, as he noticed the food supplies dwindling, he decided to use his own money to buy more provisions, but George stopped him. "It's not about how much you can spend, Carlos. It's about how much you can give, not in terms of money, but of yourself. How much are you willing to be here, to listen, to share?" George's words were harsh but sincere. So Carlos started to listen. He learned the stories of those who came to the kitchen, the young mother whose husband had died in a work accident, the elderly man who had lost his home to an unjust debt, the teenager hiding from gangs that were hunting him down. He began to see them as real people, not just as statistics of social failure. One day, the kitchen organized a small party for the children in the community. There was music, games, and special food. Carlos, who initially stayed on the sidelines, found himself surprisingly leading the event. He organized games, helped serve the food, and even ended up telling stories to the children at the end of the day. When he saw the smiles on their faces and the sparkle in their eyes, something warm and painful ignited in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something truly valuable. The 3 months flew by, and when the time came to say goodbye, Carlos realized he didn't want to leave. He looked at the kitchen, at the faces that were now familiar to him, and felt a lump in his throat. He had learned to admire the resilience of that community, to understand the depth of human suffering and the importance of compassion. But most importantly, he had learned to acknowledge his own emptiness. When he returned to the family mansion, he was no longer the cold, indifferent man who had walked through its doors months ago. He had changed, yes, but the real test was still ahead, facing his siblings and proving that it wasn't just about completing a task, but a real change in his heart. "Maybe Mother was right after all," he whispered, staring at the old portrait of his mother in the living room. He had completed his challenge, but a long road still lay ahead. The music pounded in the small bar, drowning out conversations and wrapping the atmosphere in a dark and chaotic aura. Esteban stumbled towards the exit, his vision blurred by alcohol and his fingers trembling slightly as he lit a cigarette. Despite the constant buzz in his mind, Ricardo's words echoed like an annoying reminder. "You must seek forgiveness from all those you've wronged. Only then will you receive what you think you deserve." At first, Esteban had laughed. Forgiveness? What did forgiveness matter? It was an empty word, meaningless. But as the days passed, reality began to sink in. Without money, without his mother's support, and without even the temporary comfort of drugs, he had nothing left. Now, facing the first letter from his mother, he realized how much he had ruined his life and how many hearts he had shattered along the way. The list of people he needed to apologize to was long, but one name stood out like a haunting specter that refused to disappear. His old friend, Samuel. Samuel had been more than a friend. He was like a brother to Esteban. They had grown up together, sharing dreams and melodies when they were teenagers, and played in their small garage band. Samuel was the first person to believe in Esteban's talent and encouraged him to pursue a musical career. But when addictions began consuming him, Esteban not only betrayed his trust, but also took advantage of him. He swindled him, stole money from his studio, and left him burdened with a debt that almost cost him his house. The phone shook in Esteban's hand as he dialed Samuel's number. The calls he had made so far, to old friends, colleagues, even to his own family, had been painful, but this was the one he dreaded most. When Samuel answered with a curt, "What do you want, Esteban?" he swallowed hard. "It's me. I want to talk to you." There was a long silence on the line. Then Samuel sighed. "I'll give you 5 minutes." That first meeting was brief and tense. Samuel looked tired, prematurely aged, with deep lines on his face and hair that had turned grey too early. Esteban felt a pang of guilt, realizing how much his friend had changed since he last saw him. Samuel stared at him with a furrowed brow, arms crossed over his chest, as if still expecting an attack. "Why now?" Samuel finally asked. "After everything you did, why are you coming to ask for forgiveness now?" Esteban lowered his gaze, struggling to find the words. "I don't have an answer that will satisfy you, I know. I'm just realizing how much I failed you. I want to make amends. I want to repay what I owe you." Samuel let out a bitter laugh. "Repay?" he repeated sarcastically. "There's no amount of money that can repay the betrayal of a friend. You left me with nothing, Esteban. You took more than money. You took away my faith in people." Esteban bowed his head, feeling the sting of tears in his eyes. But he couldn't give up. He had destroyed too many things in his life. He couldn't let this be another. Yet Samuel didn't forgive him. He didn't welcome him back into his life. All he did was turn his back and walk away, leaving him alone on the sidewalk, trembling in the cold night wind. In the following weeks, Esteban tried to reach out to others on his list. Some listened, others rejected him outright. Some even slammed the door in his face. Each encounter was a small stab to his heart. But little by little, that painful routine of apologies began to transform him. Every word of remorse, every look of disdain he received, made him realize the true weight of his actions. He began to understand that forgiveness was not a right. It was something he had to earn, something he couldn't even demand. One day, while looking for the number of an old bandmate he owed an apology for abandoning in the middle of a tour, he received an unexpected call. It was Samuel. "I need you at the rehab center," he said brusquely. "Don't ask why, just come." The rehabilitation center Samuel took him to was small and modest, but it was filled with young people with restless eyes and trembling hands. They were boys and girls who, like him, had fallen into the dark pit of addiction and were now fighting to climb out. Samuel reluctantly introduced him as a special guest. Esteban felt the eyes of suspicion on him. What could a failure like him offer? But as he sat down and listened to their stories, something began to resonate inside him. Over the following weeks, Samuel brought him to the center every day. He didn't ask him to speak or get involved. He only asked him to listen. The young people in the center were a reflection of his own past. Broken promises, wasted dreams, destroyed relationships. At first, he felt powerless and disgusted with himself, but little by little, he began to open up. He started sharing his story, not as a role model, but as a warning. He talked about the times he had lost everything, the nights he spent on the streets, how he had seen death's face and had still been too much of a coward to face it. His words began to have an impact. The kids listened to him, not because he was someone special, but because he was like them. Every time he spoke with one of the young people, he felt himself healing a little more. And something even more unexpected happened. Samuel began to trust him again, even if just a little. One afternoon, after talking to a young man who had been on the brink of suicide, Samuel looked at him closely. "You've changed," he said softly, "but I want to see how long you last. It's not easy to stay standing when things get tough." Esteban nodded. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to convince Samuel that he was now a better person. He knew that words meant nothing without actions, so instead of promising change, he simply stayed. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Esteban began to earn the respect of the young people at the center, not as a figure of authority, but as someone who understood their pain. His challenge, which had seemed impossible at first, became his own process of redemption. He found himself in every story of struggle, and with every conversation, he began to piece together the shattered fragments of his life. When he finally felt ready to close this chapter, he returned to Samuel's house. His heart was pounding as he knocked on the door and waited. Samuel greeted him with a neutral expression, but there was something different in his eyes. "Thank you," Samuel said suddenly. Esteban looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For staying, for not giving up. I never thought you could do it." Samuel sighed and then extended his hand. "I don't know if I can forgive you completely, but I'm willing to try." Esteban felt something warm flood his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope. He grasped Samuel's hand firmly and nodded. "Trying is more than I deserve." That night, as he returned to the family mansion, Esteban knew he had changed. He hadn't completed the challenge just for the inheritance. He had rediscovered something far more valuable, the true meaning of forgiveness and redemption. As he arrived at the mansion, he looked at the garden with the lights off and felt a calm he hadn't experienced in years. Perhaps, just perhaps, he was ready for the next step, facing his siblings and proving that the change was not just an act, but a genuine desire to be a better person. Esteban's journey wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, he was moving in the right direction. Martha drove her flashy red sports car down the winding road leading to the old house of her childhood, the family mansion where she had grown up. The thought of spending a month in that place filled her with discomfort and resentment. She had spent years distancing herself from that site, building a life where she didn't have to look back or face the truth of who she was. Why should she subject herself to this challenge imposed by her mother? Who was her mother to strip her of her right to the inheritance just because she wanted her to change? But Mrs. Victoria's words kept echoing in her mind. If you want to receive the inheritance, you must rediscover yourself and learn to live without the shallow glimmer of appearances. When the car stopped in front of the mansion's large iron gate, Martha remained silent, staring at the imposing structure. Despite the years and the overgrown state of the garden, the house still retained its aura of grandeur. But now, instead of dazzling her, the house looked back at her with empty eyes, as if returning the same indifference she had shown to her family. She got out of the car with a sigh and opened the trunk. Her luggage consisted of multiple suitcases filled with designer clothes, makeup, and all the accessories she thought necessary to survive a month. But as she looked at the garden overrun with weeds and the dust-covered windows, she felt that each of those items was like a reminder of her superficiality. Inside the house, everything was exactly as she remembered, yet at the same time completely different. The rooms, once so full of life, felt cold and empty. The air smelled stale, like a forgotten past. Martha walked through the hallways hesitantly, looking at the furniture covered with sheets and the old photos hanging on the walls. There they were, the images of her childhood, her, in frilly dresses and ribbons, smiling like the princess of the house, the beloved, pampered little girl who always got what she wanted. But the more she looked at those pictures, the more she felt like she was staring at a stranger. The first night was a disaster. Without a TV, without the constant hum of social media, and without the frantic pace of her usual life, Martha felt lost. She wandered through the house, checking her phone compulsively, and every time she saw a new post from her friends at parties or events, her anxiety grew. She had made a quick post upon arrival, a perfect selfie at the mansion's entrance with the caption, "Back to my roots." But the reality was very different. She felt trapped, alone, and disoriented. By the third day, with her phone turned off due to a dead battery, since there were no compatible chargers in the old house, Martha found herself facing the only company she had left. Silence. Time seemed to have stopped inside the mansion. She tried to fill the hours by superficially cleaning some rooms, but quickly gave up. Bored and frustrated, she ended up wandering through the attic, a place she had always avoided as a child because it seemed gloomy and eerie. While rummaging through old boxes, she found something she hadn't expected: a small trunk containing a worn leather diary and a necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. Upon opening the diary, she immediately recognized her mother's elegant and precise handwriting. It was her personal journal. At first, she hesitated to read it, but something inside her, a curiosity she hadn't felt in years, pushed her to open its pages. The first days at the mansion turned into nights of feverish reading. Her mother's diary was a testament of love, pain, and sacrifice. Martha discovered that her mother had written about her in almost every entry. Mrs. Victoria had documented every moment of her growth, from Martha's first steps to the sleepless nights spent worrying about her teenage insecurities. There were also unsent letters, full of words her mother had never dared to say to her. "I wish you could see how much you're worth, Martha. Not because of how you look, but because of the light you have inside, which you always try to hide." As she read, silent tears rolled down her cheeks. Every page revealed a level of love and devotion Martha had never imagined. But there was also sadness and disappointment. Her mother had noticed every small change in her as she grew up, every time she sought more attention on social media, every time she sacrificed her true self to fit into a superficial world. The pain Mrs. Victoria felt for not being able to reconnect with her daughter was etched into every line. In the diary, there were also references to things Martha had completely forgotten. like the time her mother stayed up all night, hand-sewing a butterfly costume for the spring contest because Martha insisted she wanted to be the most beautiful butterfly. Her mother didn't have the money to buy a fancy costume, so she created one from scratch. Martha won first place but barely thanked her. Reading this made her shudder with shame. How had she been so blind? The days passed, and Martha stopped worrying about her hair or what her followers might be thinking. She began to live more in the present, to look at the house with different eyes. The memories she had tried to bury came rushing back. The weekends spent baking cookies in the kitchen with her mother, the afternoons playing in the garden with her brothers, the times Mrs. Victoria stayed up late helping her with her homework, because Martha refused to ask anyone else for help. One morning, driven by a new sense of longing, Martha decided to enter the kitchen and recreate one of the recipes from her mother's journal, a lemon cake they used to bake together. As she turned on the oven and began mixing the ingredients, something changed. She wasn't the socialite worried about perfection anymore. She was just a woman trying to connect with the memory of someone she was finally starting to see as more than just a symbol. When the cake was done, she tasted it, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to savor something without worrying about calories or whether it was Instagram-worthy. Every day brought a small transformation. Without the constant noise of social media and the need to be visible to everyone, she began to remember what truly made her happy. She rediscovered her love for painting and spent hours in the old art studio in the house, doodling and experimenting, feeling like she was once again the little girl who dreamed of being an artist before the obsession with being seen turned her into what she had become. A month later, when the day came for her to leave, Martha was no longer the same woman who had arrived at the mansion with luxurious dresses and sparkling accessories. Her suitcases were still filled with expensive clothes and makeup, but she wasn't. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time before leaving, and what she saw was a woman with brighter eyes and a clearer mind. A woman who, at last, was beginning to understand what her mother had always tried to teach her. True beauty is not reflected in appearances, but in the value of who you are. Before leaving, she took the heart-shaped pendant necklace she found in the attic and put it around her neck. She closed the mansion door and looked back, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. She had come for the inheritance, but what she was truly taking away was something far more valuable: the truth about herself. When Martha arrived at the family mansion, ready to meet her brothers, she did so with a lighter heart and a clearer mind than ever before. She was prepared to face them and, for the first time, speak to them as a real sister, not as a competitor. The real test was still about to begin, but this time she felt stronger, not because of how she looked or what others thought of her, but because she had finally learned to see herself through her mother's eyes, with love and honesty. The mansion, with its majestic windows and imposing facade, stood against the cloudy sky like a sleeping giant, waiting for the return of its heirs. The three siblings, Carlos, Esteban, and Martha, arrived separately. Each came from a very different journey, but all shared the same mix of anxiety and determination. They had spent months facing challenges that forced them to look inside themselves, and although the wounds hadn't fully healed, the desire to change was palpable. However, they weren't prepared for the final challenge, the ultimate test of redemption, together. Carlos was the first to arrive. He stepped out of his car with a frown and clenched hands, his knuckles white with tension. Although his eyes no longer reflected the arrogance they once did, his rigid posture made it clear that there was still an internal struggle. He had spent 3 months at the community kitchen, learning to see people as more than just figures on a balance sheet, but it was still difficult for him to show vulnerability in front of his siblings. When he stepped into the grand foyer, he paused for a moment, inhaling deeply. Everything was just as he remembered: the red carpet stretching up the stairs, the portrait of his parents hanging on the wall. But there was something new in the air, a sense of expectation and fear. Esteban arrived shortly after, his gaze shifty and his hands nervously fiddling with a keychain in his pocket. Although his face looked calmer, there were still traces of anxiety. He had worked tirelessly at the rehab center, confronting his past and helping others escape the hell of addiction, but facing his family was a test that weighed on him much more heavily. When he stepped into the house and saw Carlos, they looked at each other in silence. There was no warm greeting, just a brief exchange of cautious glances. Esteban lowered his gaze and murmured, "Carlos." "Esteban," Carlos replied, nodding slightly. Neither of them knew what to say next. It was as if they were walking through a minefield, unsure of what the right next step would be. Before the tension became unbearable, the door opened again, and Martha appeared in the doorway. She looked different. Her appearance was still elegant, but she no longer carried that air of vanity and superiority. Instead of flashy clothes and heavy makeup, she wore a simple dress and had her hair tied back in a braid. Her eyes, once filled with superficiality, now reflected something much deeper, humility and a calmness that surprised them both. "Hello," she greeted softly. Carlos and Esteban nodded, still wordless. There was a strange feeling hovering between them, as if the mansion itself was watching. Each one tried to hide their own vulnerability, as if showing their true emotions would weaken them in front of the others. For years, they had seen each other more as competitors than as siblings. But their mother's final challenge was not about individual strength, it was about unity. Ricardo, the family lawyer, was waiting for them in the grand living room. When he saw them enter together, his face showed a slight expression of surprise, followed by an almost imperceptible smile. "Thank you for coming," he said in a calm voice. "This will be the last step of the challenge Mrs. Victoria left for you." She believed that the true inheritance wasn't the material wealth, but the family. But to receive the inheritance, you must prove that you can work together, setting aside your resentments and pride. Carlos, Esteban, and Martha looked at each other, bewildered. "What do you mean, work together?" Carlos asked, the tension evident in his voice. Ricardo led them to the center of the room, where a series of boxes and documents were stacked on a table. In the middle was an old golden key. "I want you to rebuild this mansion, not in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense. Every corner of this house is filled with memories of love, but also of pain and resentment. To make this mansion a home again, you must work together to redecorate the rooms, restore the gardens, and bring life back to this place. You will have a month to do so. During this time, you must live here, cohabit, and show that you can be a family again." "Are you saying we have to restore the house like laborers?" Martha exclaimed, incredulous. "Exactly," Ricardo nodded. "But it's not just about changing curtains and furniture. Each of you has something to contribute, and the only way to achieve this is by collaborating and setting aside your differences." The atmosphere in the room became tense. Carlos gritted his teeth, Esteban frowned, and Martha looked at her brothers with uncertainty. How could they do something like this when they couldn't even hold a civilized conversation? "This is ridiculous," Carlos muttered. "How is this supposed to prove anything?" "It's what she wanted," Ricardo responded serenely. "And if you decide not to do it, you'll receive nothing." The words landed heavily. The three siblings exchanged frustrated glances, but none of them moved. Finally, it was Martha who spoke. "Fine," she said softly but firmly. "I'll do it. If this is what Mom wanted, then I'll do it." Carlos looked at her skeptically, but the sincerity in his sister's tone surprised him. Esteban beside him sighed and nodded slowly. "So will I." His voice was low, but there was a new determination in it. Carlos remained silent for a moment longer. Then, with a resigned sigh, he looked up at the portrait of their mother hanging on the wall. "All right, we'll do it. But it's going to be hard." With the decision made, the three siblings began their task the next day. The first few days were chaotic and full of friction. Carlos, with his business mindset, tried to organize everything in a strict and structured manner, assigning tasks as if he were managing a multi-million-dollar project. But his authoritarian approach soon clashed with Esteban's chaotic creativity, as he preferred to improvise and do things at his own pace. Martha, on the other hand, tried to act as a mediator, but her lack of confidence and insecurity kept her from taking control. The arguments were constant. From the color of the walls to what to do with the old piano in the living room, every decision turned into a battlefield. But something strange began to happen. Amidst the yelling and accusations, small reconciliations also emerged. Carlos started listening to Esteban's ideas more attentively, and Esteban stopped dismissing his older brother's practical suggestions. Martha, who had initially stayed on the sidelines, began voicing her own opinions, and soon they discovered that she had an unexpectedly good eye for details and decor. One afternoon, while they were working together in the library, Carlos put down his hammer and looked at his siblings with a serious expression. "You know, when Mom died, I thought it was just about the money," he said quietly, his voice filled with honesty. "But now I realize she wanted something more." Esteban looked up, surprised, and Martha paused her painting. "What do you mean?" she asked. Carlos took a deep breath and glanced around. "She wanted us to become a family again." Silence filled the room. For a moment, they all set down their tools and looked at each other as if really seeing each other for the first time in years, not as enemies or competitors, but as siblings. It was a small, almost insignificant moment, but it was the first step towards something bigger. Over the next month, the house slowly began to transform. The gardens blossomed again, the rooms filled with light and warmth, and the mansion, once a symbol of distance and coldness, started to regain the joy of the past. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, old wounds resurfacing, but there were also laughter and shared memories. At the end of the month, the three gathered in the main hall. They were exhausted, covered in dust and paint, but they were smiling. Ricardo appeared with a serious expression, but there was a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "Well done," he said simply. "You've completed the challenge. But now, the question is, what comes next? Will this house be just another facade? Or have you really learned to be a family?" The three siblings looked at each other, and this time, they knew the answer. "I want to keep going," Martha said softly. "I don't want this to end here." Esteban nodded, and for the first time, Carlos gave them a genuine smile. "Yes, let's keep going." They had overcome the final challenge, but in reality, the true gift their mother had left them was much more than a restored mansion. It was the chance to become the family they had once lost. The morning sun poured softly through the mansion's grand windows, illuminating the newly restored furniture and carefully dusted paintings. The atmosphere was very different from the day the three siblings had arrived to read the will for the first time. The house, which once felt like a somber mausoleum, now brimmed with light, color, and a renewed energy that had been missing for many years. However, that morning, there was a sense of anticipation that kept Carlos, Esteban, and Martha in a tense silence. Ricardo had summoned them to the library, the heart of the mansion, and a place that, in the past, had been their mother's sanctuary. The room was filled with shelves of old books and family documents. A large mahogany table stood at the center, with 3 chairs prepared for the siblings. On the table rested an old video player and a sealed envelope, as if patiently awaiting their moment. "Please, take a seat," Ricardo requested, in his usual calm tone. The 3 siblings obeyed, exchanging curious and slightly nervous glances. They had spent a month working side by side, rebuilding the house, rediscovering who they were as a family, but they still didn't know what the final verdict would be. They had completed their individual tasks and then the joint challenge, and although the mansion now felt warmer, none of them were sure if they had truly passed the last test. After all, this wasn't just about redecorating walls, it was about proving that they could be the family their mother had always wanted. "This video," Ricardo said, gesturing to the player, "was recorded by Mrs. Victoria as part of her last will. It is the final message she wanted to leave you, her definitive decision regarding the inheritance and her true intention behind all of this. His eyes softened as he noticed the uncertainty in their faces. Be prepared. This is not just a reading of a will, it's much more. With a solemn nod, Ricardo turned on the player and stepped back, allowing the screen to come to life. The three siblings leaned forward, holding their breath as their mother's image appeared. Mrs. Victoria, seated in her favorite armchair with the library as the backdrop, looked almost ethereal. She wore a simple light blue dress, and her hair, grey and tied in an elegant bun, highlighted the serenity on her face. But it wasn't her expression that impacted her children. It was her eyes. They were filled with deep sadness, but also hope. "My dear children," she began, her voice echoing like a distant memory. "If you are watching this, it means you have gone through all the challenges I left for you. And I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that I am very proud of each of you. What you have done is not easy. You have faced your own demons and tried to rebuild something that seemed beyond repair. But there is still something you must hear." The siblings leaned a little closer to the screen, their hearts pounding. Mrs. Victoria's expression changed, becoming more serious. "I want to tell you a story," she said. "A story about how our family fell apart, not just because of your decisions, but because of mine." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. "I always wanted the best for you, but somewhere along the way, I got lost in my desire to protect you, and I ended up pushing you away. I fought so hard to ensure you had everything I never did, that I forgot something fundamental. You didn't need wealth or comfort. You needed me. And I wasn't there." Martha's eyes filled with tears, and Carlos clenched his jaw, trying to contain the emotion flooding his chest. Esteban looked down, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. None of them expected this. They had anticipated judgment, a list of successes or failures, but instead, they were receiving their mother's confession. "Each of you got lost on the wrong path because I didn't know how to guide you," Mrs. Victoria continued. "Carlos, you always wanted to be strong and protect us, but you became obsessed with control and power. Esteban, you were sensitive and full of dreams, but I abandoned you emotionally when you needed me the most, and you sank into despair. And you, Martha." Her eyes softened with tenderness. "My little one, you always wanted to be seen, to be loved, but I only saw your achievements and never showed you that what I truly valued was the person behind all of that." Martha couldn't hold back her tears any longer. Esteban wiped his eyes with his sleeve, and Carlos, the most reluctant to show emotions, let out a shaky breath. Their mother's voice was like a balm and a wound at the same time. "I brought you back here not for the money or the inheritance," said Mrs. Victoria, her tone firmer, "but because I wanted to give you something much more important, one last chance to be the family I always dreamed you could be. I wanted you to remember what it means to be siblings, what it means to have someone to rely on when everything else falls apart. But I also wanted you to understand that if you decide not to stay together after this, I won't judge you. I just want you to find the peace and love you deserve." She paused and took a deep breath before continuing. "As for the inheritance..." Carlos, Esteban, and Martha unconsciously leaned forward, their hearts pounding in unison. "I haven't left it to any one of you." The silence that followed was so overwhelming that they could almost hear their own heartbeats. "I've left it to all three of you, together." The siblings blinked, processing her words. What did that mean? Together. Only if you choose to work as a family, manage it as a family, and continue supporting each other, will the inheritance be yours. Mrs. Victoria's gaze grew intense. "If any one of you tries to claim it alone, or if you drift apart again, everything will be donated to charity. But if you can truly show that you've changed, not just in these months, but for real, then..." The real inheritance will be yours." The three siblings sat in silence, absorbing what they had just heard. The video ended with a sad smile from Mrs. Victoria. "I love all three of you, more than you can ever imagine, and I hope, with all my heart, that you find a way to become a family again, because that's the true legacy I want to leave you." The screen went black, leaving the siblings in overwhelming silence. Each of them had spent months facing their own challenges, thinking that the final reward would be money, properties, power. But instead, what their mother offered them was something much more complex, a chance to redeem themselves, to rebuild not just a mansion, but a family that had been broken a long time ago. Finally, Carlos spoke, his voice rough from the restrained emotion. This isn't about the house or the money." He looked at his siblings with a sincerity he had never shown before. "It's about us." Esteban nodded slowly. "It's about reclaiming what we lost," he murmured. Martha, still with tears in her eyes, smiled at them sadly. "Can we do it?" she whispered. "Can we be the family Mom wanted us to be?" There was a long, tense pause. But in that pause, something changed, something deep and fundamental. Esteban extended his hand, and then Carlos, hesitating at first, did the same. Martha looked at them, and with a lump in her throat, placed her hand over theirs. "Together," Carlos said firmly. "We'll do this together." The decision was made. They had accepted their mother's final challenge, and this time it wasn't for the inheritance. It was for something far more valuable, the desire to finally honor their true legacy as a family. The afternoon was cloudy when the three siblings gathered in the grand main hall of the mansion, waiting for what they thought would be the conclusion of their journey. After watching their mother's final message, Carlos, Esteban, and Martha had decided to move forward together. Over the next month, they dedicated themselves to rebuilding not just the house, but also the broken bonds between them. They had gone from being three people who could barely tolerate each other to truly being siblings again. But despite all the work, the conversations, and the reconciliations, they still felt that something was missing. That day, Ricardo had summoned them with a more solemn expression than usual. It wasn't the first time he had called them to share news about the inheritance, but this time his tone was different. It was loaded with something they couldn't define. "Today, the final revelation will be made," Ricardo announced, looking at the three of them. "But I need you to stay calm and remember everything you've learned so far." They all nodded, though confusion and concern were evident in their expressions. Carlos crossed his arms, as if trying to protect himself from what was coming. Esteban nervously played with a lock of his hair, and Martha clenched her hands in her lap, trying to stop her fingers from trembling. "I want you to come with me," Ricardo said, gesturing for them to follow him down the hallway to a closed door at the end of the main foyer, a door they had never crossed during the entire restoration process. "What's in there?" Martha asked, her voice reflecting a slight tremor of nervousness. "It's something you need to see for yourselves," Ricardo responded. The door creaked softly as it opened, revealing the entrance to Mrs. Victoria's private library. The scent of old books and polished wood enveloped them as they stepped inside. The room was shrouded in a gentle dimness, with the curtains only slightly parted, letting in thin beams of light that fell across the marble floor. "Please wait here," Ricardo said, leaving them alone for a moment. The three siblings exchanged uncertain glances. They didn't know what to expect. Martha took a step forward and gently ran her fingers over the spines of the books, recalling the nights when their mother would read her fairy tales beside that very bookshelf. Esteban looked at the old musical instruments their mother had collected for him, feeling a mixture of pain and gratitude. And Carlos, though more reserved, noticed the small trophies and certificates she had kept so lovingly. Then they heard the sound of footsteps approaching down the hallway. Ricardo returned, but he wasn't alone. The air seemed to still when a figure appeared behind him, a tall woman with a serene demeanor and a deep gaze they hadn't seen in months. Their mother, Mrs. Victoria, in the flesh. "Mom!" Martha gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. She took a step back, covering her mouth with both hands as tears began to stream down her cheeks. Carlos and Esteban stood frozen in place, their faces reflecting a mix of astonishment, shock, and an emotion they couldn't define. "How?" Carlos managed to murmur. Mrs. Victoria stepped forward slowly, looking at them with tenderness and a hint of sadness. She seemed more fragile than they remembered, but her eyes still held that spark of strength that had always defined her. "My dear children," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with pent-up emotion. "I didn't expect it to be so hard to stay away from you, but I needed to do this to give you the chance to grow." Esteban was the first to react. He took a step forward, his face crumpling under the weight of the tears welling up in his eyes. "Mom, why? Why did you do this?" His voice was a whisper, filled with pain and confusion. "I did it because I wanted to give you something money could never buy," she replied. "I wanted to give you the chance to rediscover yourselves, and most importantly, to rediscover each other as siblings. If I had stayed, if I had just left you the inheritance outright, you would never have reached this point." She paused, looking each of them in the eye. "I knew that the only way to show you what truly matters was to leave, even if it was only temporary." Carlos took a step forward, his face tense with a mix of anger and relief. "You made us believe you were dead, Mom," he said hoarsely. "Do you know what that did to us?" Mrs. Victoria looked at him with infinite sadness, nodding slowly. "I know, son." She sighed and reached out, gently touching Carlos's cheek. "But I also knew you needed to feel that loss to understand what really mattered. And now I see you. And I know it was worth it." Martha couldn't hold back any longer. She threw herself into her mother's arms, sobbing like a little girl. "I hate you for leaving us like that. But I love you so much," she murmured through her tears. Mrs. Victoria held her gently, stroking her hair like she used to when Martha was small. "And I love you, my little one. Always." Esteban, unable to move, simply watched, his eyes brimming with tears. Carlos looked at his mother intently, trying to process what he was feeling. Then, with a long, trembling sigh, he finally let go of the hardness he had carried for so long. He moved closer to his mother and, without a word, knelt beside her and embraced her too. Mrs. Victoria wrapped her arms around all three of them, as if trying to shield them from all the pain they had experienced. The family, broken for so long, had finally found its way back to each other. "Does this mean that you're here to stay?" Esteban asked quietly, hope shining in his eyes. "It means that I will always be with you one way or another," she replied. "But my role here is done. You no longer need me to guide you. You've made it. Now, it's time for you to continue on your own." The three of them pulled back slightly, looking at her with fear and uncertainty. "Are you leaving again?" Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," she said, shaking her head gently. "I'm not leaving. But I won't be the center of your lives anymore." She smiled, that unique smile only a mother could give. "It's time for you to build your own path. Together." The siblings nodded slowly, reluctantly understanding what she meant. Mrs. Victoria wouldn't be physically gone, but she wanted them to be the ones to take charge. They had regained their mother, but more importantly, they had regained something they didn't even realize they had lost, the ability to be a true family. When they finally let go, the mansion around them seemed even brighter, as if Mrs. Victoria's presence had blessed it with new life. "Together," Carlos repeated softly, looking at his siblings and then at his mother. "That's how she always wanted it to be." "And that's how it will be," Esteban affirmed. "For Mom," Martha said, intertwining her hands with her brother's. Mrs. Victoria looked at her children with a smile full of pride and love. "For the family," she whispered. And so, the legacy she had tried to build finally came to life. Not in the form of money or properties, but in the hearts of her children, who were now, for the first time in a long while, truly united. The afternoon sun shone brightly over the grand mansion, casting soft golden shadows through the open windows. Outside, the garden blossomed in vibrant colors, as if nature itself were celebrating the new beginning for the Diaz family. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air, and a warm breeze gently caressed the branches of the trees, making the leaves dance softly to a silent melody. The three siblings were gathered in the grand dining room, around the very table where Mrs. Victoria had waited alone on that last birthday, hoping her children would come visit her. But now, the table wasn't empty. The plates were filled with homemade food, lively laughter and animated conversations filled the air, and the chairs, at long last, were occupied. Mrs. Victoria sat at the head of the table, watching her children with a look of satisfaction and peace. It had been months since her return and the revelation of the truth. In that time, each of them had continued to grow, healing old wounds and creating new opportunities. That day was special, not because of its material significance, but for what it represented. The first time in many years that the siblings were gathered not for personal gain, but for a common purpose. "I never thought I'd say this, but you've actually learned to cook, Carlos," Esteban joked, laughing as he tasted the stew Carlos had made with his own hands. Carlos, who would have once scoffed at such a mundane task, just smiled and shrugged. "Well, I had a good teacher at the community kitchen, and besides, I found it's more relaxing than running business meetings." Martha laughed softly, whipping a tear from her eye from the laughter. The great Carlos Diaz, making stews for the family. Who would have thought? But there was love and pride in her eyes, and Carlos noticed. He returned the smile with a warmth he had never shown before. It was incredible how much they had changed in such a short time. "And what about you, Martha?" he asked, changing the subject. "What's going on with that art project you mentioned?" Martha blushed a little, looking at her hands as if suddenly the idea of talking about her own achievements made her uncomfortable. "Well, I've been working on a series of paintings inspired by the family's stories," she replied shyly. "You know, memories from when we were kids, things Mom mentioned in her journal." Mrs. Victoria looked at her with a special glimmer in her eyes. "Family memories?" she asked curiously. "I'd love to see them, dear." Martha nodded, touched by her mother's genuine interest. She got up and went to the grand hall, where she had prepared a surprise. When she returned, she was carrying 3 canvases covered with sheets. She placed them one by one in the center of the dining room and, with a gentle pull, unveiled them. The first painting was a portrait of the 3 siblings, depicted as young children, running together through the mansion's garden. Their faces reflected joy and carefree innocence, capturing the essence of a time when life was simpler and love was purer. The painting was filled with light and color, as if every brushstroke were alive. The second painting showed Mrs. Victoria in the kitchen, with a focused expression and a slight smile on her lips as she cooked. But what made the painting special wasn't just her face, it was the details in the background, the shadowy figures of 3 children peeking through the doorway, watching her with awe and love. It was an image of sacrifice and care, a representation of the true heart of the family. The final painting was different. It portrayed the 3 siblings, now adults, sitting together in the grand living room of the mansion, surrounded by the same furniture and decorations that once seemed gloomy and cold, but now felt full of warmth and life. But the most striking detail was the blurred figure at the center, a spirit of light, watching over them with love. It had no face, but everyone knew who it was. The soul of their mother, the true heart of the family. Esteban swallowed hard, moved by the beauty and depth of the paintings. "Martha, they're beautiful." Carlos nodded, unable to take his eyes off the paintings. "They really are. You captured..." He paused, searching for the words. "You captured everything." Martha looked down, blushing from the compliments, but happy to have expressed through art what words never could. "I just wanted us to remember who we really are," she said softly. "I wanted Mom to see that we understand what she tried to do for us." She looked at Mrs. Victoria, her eyes shining with emotion. "I wanted you to know that we won't forget." Mrs. Victoria stood slowly and walked over to the paintings. Her eyes filled with tears as she took in every detail, every brushstroke, every expression. Then, without a word, she wrapped Martha in a tight embrace. "I am so proud of you, dear," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Martha closed her eyes, savoring the warmth of her mother's embrace. She had spent so long seeking approval in the wrong places, when the only validation she ever truly needed was from this woman, the one who had loved her from the very beginning. "Thank you, Mom." After a while, Mrs. Victoria pulled back and looked at her 3 children, standing together, looking at her with love and devotion. It wasn't the first time she had seen them like this since her return, but it felt like the first time she truly saw them as what she had always dreamed, a united family, ready to face the future as a team. "You are my true legacy," she said with a radiant smile. "Not the properties, not the bank accounts, not even this house. You. And knowing that you'll stay together, that you'll look out for each other. That's more than I could have ever asked for." The 3 nodded, and in that moment, no more words were needed. They knew that what they had found was far more valuable than any material inheritance. They had recovered something they thought was lost forever: their bond as siblings, their mutual respect, and the unconditional love that had always connected them. Carlos looked at his mother with a renewed light in his eyes. "Thank you, Mom, for not giving up on us." Esteban, moved, stepped forward and took her hand. "I'm so sorry. For everything." And Martha, with tears of happiness in her eyes, smiled through her sobs. "We promise we won't lose each other again." Mrs. Victoria embraced all 3 of them, holding them tight with all the love and strength she still had. "You never will, because this time, you're stronger. You've become the family I always knew you could be." And so, in that embrace, under the golden light of the sunset that bathed the mansion, Mrs. Victoria's true legacy was fulfilled. It wasn't about the money, the properties, or the power. It was the miracle of having reunited her children, of turning pain into hope and resentment into love. The mansion, renewed and filled with life, became a symbol of their story, a place where the past transformed into the future, where wounds turned into healed scars, and where, finally, the true treasure of the Diaz family, love, found its home. And with that peace, Mrs. Victoria knew her mission was complete. The children would keep the material inheritance, but more importantly, they would carry the real legacy, the certainty that, together, they would always be unstoppable. "For the family," whispered Esteban. "For Mum," said Martha. "For us," Carlos concluded. And so, Mrs. Victoria's legacy would endure forever. And with that, we wrap up this incredible story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone special, and subscribe for more stories filled with emotion and reflection. Remember, a true legacy isn't always measured in wealth, but in the bonds we build and nurture. See you in the next story.